All right, while folks are looking for records, today's class is going to have an actual soundtrack, okay? What we're going to do is that we're just going to go down the line, and everyone's going to take a shot at actually just playing a record. I want you to pick up this needle. There's a little handle over here, and just put it down where you see like a fairly dark line. It could be right at the edge of the record. It could be in between records. It could be in between somewhere in the record. It could be, well, don't put it near the center of the record because that's just going to play silence for the rest of class. What I want you to do is I want you to pick up the needle and just place it down while the turntable is spinning. All right. So if I put it down right at the edge of the record, eventually the music will start playing. How many of you have a record with a really large hole in the middle? Okay, you will probably need this. This is a 7-inch adapter that's used for records with those large holes. So you put that on first, then put your record down. Yep. This is really low in pitch because this record was designed to be played at a faster speed. So there's a 45 button on the side. Try hitting it. This sounds good. Good job. Yep. So yeah, you can lift it up and put it to the side. Yep. So there's a 33 and there's a 45. Anyone has any idea what those numbers mean? 33, 1/3, or 45 rotations per minute. Go ahead and take your record off. Yep. These first couple of weeks, we're going to be focusing on the selection of your music. Over here, I have 3 DJs that primarily made their mark by having and playing music that other DJs in the same scene and at the same time were not playing. Nice. Does anyone recognize any of these DJs? On the left, we have Africa Bambaataa. He was I think known as like the king of record collectors among the DJs that were involved in early hip hop. He made his mark by having more records than any of the other DJs, basically, and he would play records that other DJs wouldn't play, like German experimental electronic music. Some of you might now know that as electro, so groups like Kraftwerk, for instance. Eventually, he folded a lot of that sound into his own productions, and it created one particular genre of hip hop, of this very high tempo, from a German beat, basically, and rappers rapping on top of that. On the right, we have Ian Levine from the UK. He was very active in the 60s, still DJs today. And he played a lot of those soul records from America. Like he would fly over to America, find obscure soul records that even most Americans hadn't heard of, bring them over to the UK where nobody had heard these records, and play them as exclusive music that no one else could have. On the right, we have David Rodigan, again based in the UK, doing the same thing, only he went to Jamaica instead. To get Jamaican reggae, ska, rocksteady, and bringing that over to the UK, playing it on the radio. In his case, he started out on the radio, but eventually went into DJing live events as well. So back to this idea of crate digging. That's basically what all of you just did today. You looked into a crate and dug for stuff that you thought might look interesting. And then if you were in a record store, sometimes in a good record store, they actually just have a turntable like this, and you can test it, and you can hear whether this is a record that you actually want to buy. Over there, we have Jay Dilla in the lower side, who very instrumental in 90s and early 2000s hip hop. On the right is more of sort of the Northern Soul. They are collecting those jukebox records, so they're a lot smaller records. And on the right, we actually have Laidback Luke, who is an EDM and techno DJ. And he's also crate digging, but he's crate digging how people would do it nowadays on the computer, right? Back in the day when all the music was on records, the problem was scarcity. Say you're into American soul records, but you're based in the UK, there's only a small number of records that are being produced in the numbers that will naturally be imported into the UK. Usually they'd have the word Motown on them. But if you want to get the sort of the rarer stuff from other labels, you have to fly over to America. And they probably didn't even print that many copies of those records in America to begin with. So finding those records will be the problem. It's kind of the opposite now. Now we have too much music. Everything's available through SoundCloud, through services like Spotify, through streaming, uploaded to YouTube legally or illegally. And you have to figure out what's good out of like all of this music. Some of it sounds very, very similar. And right now, this is actually a screenshot of Laidback Luke doing a video where he's listening to demos, like music that hasn't actually been fully produced yet, and trying to like decide which ones he wants to sign on his label. Stores that were near specific hotspots of dance would, of course, be very influential on how that scene will evolve. On the left, we have a picture of a store called Vinyl Mania in New York City. This was in the 80s. It was right outside the Paradise Garage, which I've mentioned before, which is, again, one really seminal club. We have Soul City on the right. That was over in London, and that was the store that actually came up with the name Northern Soul. Not because it came from the north, it came from the west. But all the kids from the north were buying them. So that was in London. On the top right, we have Eastern Bloc, which was actually in the north of England, in Manchester. And that was outside the Hacienda. And on the bottom right, we have Chicago, Imports, etc., which was the store that was the first store to create a section in their store marked warehouse music. There was a club called The Warehouse, where a certain DJ, Frankie Knuckles, who was originally from New York City, but he was hired to play in Chicago to bring some of that New York vibe, but in the process created a very distinct Chicago sound. There was no name for it, so people just called it warehouse music because it was the music being played at a warehouse, and that became shortened to house music. Or at least that's one story of how the words house music came about. The other story is it was music that people made at home because it was made with cheap electronic instruments. So I'll let the house fans in here read through these books and figure out which story you'd rather go with. All right. Of course, there are vinyl markets. Sometimes they happen in like convention halls. Sometimes they happen outside. There's a lot of these in Boston. Often they happen in things like hotel ballrooms. And DJs would actually, sometimes go to the extent of just booking a room at a hotel so that they can be there overnight and be the first ones in line when the market opens, and buy all of the records, dig for all the records that they wanted to get and buy it before any other DJs could. So again, they're operating in this sort of environment of scarcity, trying to get those exclusives, knowing that there's a limited supply of music out there. Record pools. Over there is Judy Weinstein, who was one of the people who ran one of the record pools in New York City that will basically be a one-stop shop for record labels to drop off unreleased music. This is music that they had produced, but they weren't sure how many copies to print. Like, we don't know if this is going to be a commercial success. It's music that's produced for the clubs, and it used to be that these labels would have individual relationships with individual DJs, but that got messy too quickly. So folks like Judy Weinstein and David Mancuso will set up a one-stop shop. If a certain record label has, say, 10 copies of a certain new track, bring it over here, and DJs will in fact come to his studio apartment and actually just pick individual copies. And so that was the birth of the record pool. And these still exist today, only now they exist in digital form. There are websites run by people like the Beat Junkies, which is very hip-hop based, DJ City, which is a little bit more open format. And there's probably a few that cater to like techno and trance as well. And the idea is that you pay a subscription, and then you can download as much music from the website as you would like, because these are all early release tracks from various record labels. But you may need to qualify to be to get an account on that website. Definitely, you have to pay a subscription, and music will be removed from that service after a couple of weeks. So it's like, this is what's new now. Once it's not new anymore and it's been commercially released to the rest of the world, you can't see it on these services anymore, because you're only supposed to have new tracks. There are some record pools that still have old tracks, and they're really not supposed to. So if you're ever wondering, where's a good record pool for 90s New Jack Swing? There really shouldn't be one, right? But there are, okay? By the way, on the right, that's Sylvester. Some of you might know that name from the disco era. Made a lot of high energy disco tracks. You Make Me Feel Mighty Real is probably Sylvester's biggest hit. Okay, the kinds of records that would show up at these record pools will look a lot like this. The promotional records, you will see things like Not For Sale, for instance. They weren't supposed to be sold in stores. On the right is a white label, literally a white label, right? This is a test pressing, right? They make maybe dozens of these. And the whole idea of these records is that they don't know if they want to commit to a 1,000 record run, or a 10,000 record run, or 100,000 record run. So they're just making a few to be issued to DJs. Inside, you will get something like this, a little feedback form. Let me see, I know. Something like that, So instead of information about what's on the record, might be just a little slip of paper that's printed on here that actually shows the track listing. If folks are interested, you can come up and take a look at this white label and try to figure out which one is side A and which one is side B. And then you get forms like this, where you state, this is the clubs that I played this at. What time did I play it? What was the crowd reaction? Right? This is the way how record labels figured out which music to mass produce. Again, we're operating in a world where music is scarce and resources are scarce. This gives you an idea of what printing that first record looks like. We've got a bunch of heat lamps to sort of soften what folks will call a lacquer. It's actually, I believe it's like an aluminum plate with a layer of lacquer on top of it. So it's soft, and it gets softer still with the heat on top of them. And then we have the sapphire cutting stylus that looks like that, magnified many, many, many times. It's like a chisel that drags through this lacquer. It creates a big of a mess, so there's usually a vacuum somewhere or a blower just like removing all of the debris that gets carved out of a record. And you end up with a groove that's vaguely V-shaped. When you actually play a record, on the other hand, you don't want something that comes to a very, very sharp tip. Otherwise, you'll be carving new grooves into your record that have nothing to do with the music, and that's not what you want. So instead, you have these round tip styli that are in there, and again, they are in different shapes. So let me give you a sort of a close-up look. This is scanning electron microscope version of what a record groove looks like and what the stylus looks like while it's running through it. So you can see it's vibrating back and forth, but it's also vibrating up and down. In fact, there's two axes that is vibrating this way and this way, stereo. X and Y, left and right. So you have 2 degrees of freedom. You can vibrate this way, you can vibrate this way. One way will be a left channel, one way will be a right channel. We have coils up here, and we have magnets down here. This stylus, this cantilever is attached to the stylus that you see in the microscope. And there's a pivot that allows it to sort of like freely rotate in a 360-degree way. Sometimes it's made out of rubber. Sometimes it's a little bit more elaborate than that. The rubber ones are cheaper to manufacture. But it's flexible and it allows it to sort of vibrate freely as it runs along the groove. And then the magnets vibrate depending on whether it deflects in one way or it deflects in the other way. Sometimes if it's a mono song where there's only one channel of music, then the left channel and the right channel are doing exactly the same thing. Then both magnets will be vibrating at the same time in phase. And that generates a very, 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 very small current. All right? That's how this cartridge works. Everything out here is called the cartridge. That last bit is called a stylus. And you can replace the stylus separately from the rest of the cartridge. So all these parts that stay stationary are often detachable from the part that moves so that you can replace this part if this part ever breaks or wears off. Because imagine there's a lot of friction going on over there. This is called a moving magnet cartridge. This is a very fancy moving coil cartridge. So instead of magnets vibrating over stationary coils, we have moving coils vibrating under stationary magnets. And coils are a lot lighter than magnets. So there's a lot more sensitive, but also a lot easier to break because we are talking about really, 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 really thin wires that are sort of freely vibrating as the needle vibrates. There are stories of DJs that will ruin hundreds of dollars of these very expensive moving coil cartridges in the early days of disco, before everybody realized, that's just not worth the money. We should get the moving magnets one. They're cheaper. They don't sound as good, but they'll actually last the night. By the way, some of you still have your records in front of you. Most of you have micro groove records, which are about 25 micrometers apart for each groove. Before this micro groove format came about, there used to be about 75 micrometers. So before World War II, a lot of records will be printed in shellac. By the way, this is literally what a record album looks like. It's an album because it collects multiple records. Okay. So, and in fact, people might want to pass this one around. And be careful, it's heavy. It's much heavier than the ones that you've been carrying around. And it's far more rigid. The reason why we don't have a lot of these in the world anymore is because the material that they're made of, shellac, it was actually a useful war material. So over in World War II, a lot of it got melted back down and used for, I guess, military equipment. They're not as cheap to manufacture as polyvinyl chloride, PVC, which is what most of the records in front of you are made of. Shellac, it actually comes from like a bug's secretions. And they actually have to harvest this organic material. It's a natural plastic that has to be heated up and then collected in large amounts and then heated up and pressed. This one, there's a crack right through the center, right there. Shellac's much more brittle than PVC. PVC bends before it breaks, and so it's a lot more resistant to damage, which is why I'm quite happy to have all of you just pick one up and try playing them. But PVC does warp. Some of you might have heard of stories of people leaving their records out in the sun and then coming back not entirely flat anymore. And that's a really difficult problem to fix. Like you need a whole bunch of really large books to sit on them for a really long time, and even then it never gets completely flat. If you look at the tips of the stylus under a microscope, you'll see there's actually several different kinds out there. There are those where they're all made from one material, typically diamond, but sometimes you get things like ruby. So these precious natural stones that are usually synthetically manufactured. Or they might have something like diamond or ruby attached to a steel shaft. So these are the bonded ones, where it's actually two materials connected to each other. These are cheaper to manufacture because this requires a very pure crystal. There's probably like 5 or 6 different shapes, but there's 2 that are very commonly used. There's the elliptical and there's the conical ones. The conical ones, basically, they're the same radius no matter how you look around it. If you took a cross section from, if I was looking at this needle from the top, it'll be a circle, right? It's a cone that comes to a sort of a rounded point. Whereas the elliptical ones are not. The radius changes depending on on which side you look at it. And there's a particularly weird one up there. Don't look at that one. I think it's called Shibata or something. It's like a patented design. But you can see the conical needle, as the groove goes, it wiggles across the record and goes from left to right. The amount of needle inside the groove changes. Sometimes it sinks in, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it sinks in, sometimes it goes up. Whereas for an elliptical stylus, it tends to sort of sit a little bit better consistently throughout the groove. That's because it's not quite so thick from front to back. It's consistently thick where it needs to be, which is touching the left sides and the right sides of the groove. Remember, we're sort of vibrating in this X formation. And it sort of keeps that shape of the groove, whereas the conical stylus will ride up and ride down. However, what Grandmaster Flash, let me see if I can find him in this picture. Excuse me. That's him right there, actually holding the boombox with the hat. So what Grandmaster Flash figured out in the early days of hip-hop is that the conical styli will actually not jump out of the record grooves quite as easily as the elliptical styli. Up until that point, the general rule of thumb or conventional wisdom was that elliptical styli sounded better than conical styli. So all DJs should use elliptical styli, especially in the world of disco, where there was a lot of effort being put in making the best quality sound possible. But Grandmaster Flash was a hip-hop DJ. He would spin the records, he'd put his hands on the records, he'd scratch them. And the more you do that, the more the needle just jumps out of place. And he found that the conical needles tend to stay in the groove a lot better than the elliptical ones, even though they don't sound as good. There's a couple of theories on why that might be. The one that I like is that because it doesn't quite ride consistently into the groove, if there's, say, a clump of dirt that's inside the bottom of the groove, there's a good chance that it's going to miss that. If I put my ear right up to the needle, I can actually hear the music right now, even though I have the volume all the way turned down. That's the actual vibration of the stylus riding on the grooves, and I welcome you to come up and have a listen later on. But if you were to do that, you will notice it's very hissy. It's very, very, very high-pitched. The music that's recorded on the record isn't the music that was produced out of the studio. They actually changed the frequency curve of what actually gets pressed onto the record. And then they reverse that process when you play back that record. There's a circuit called the RIAA equalization curve. Right now, over on the right side, there is a circuit diagram which uses tubes. So just give you an idea of how old this design goes, which actually applies this equalization curve. Bass in tracks like hip hop, for instance, can get really, really loud, but that also means you've got this massive deflection in the groove, and it go too far, and your needle just goes flying. It just hops out of the groove where it is and lands in a random place. So what they do when they press these records is that they reduce all of the bass and bring up all of the high frequencies. And then when you actually play it back through something like a mixer like this, and in some cases it's built directly into the turntable, you have a circuit that does the opposite. It brings the high frequencies down and it boosts the bass again, so that you get something that sounds a lot like what you started with. But it's never exactly the same, because the person who made the circuit for your turntable or for your mixer is not the same person who's working in a record plant pressing these records, right? It's a different circuit. So some people say records have a sound. And just from this, they absolutely do. They absolutely have their own sound. Different turntables can have their own sound. Different amplification systems are going to have the sound, because everyone's going to implement that circuit slightly differently. Even though there is a standard that's published by the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, everyone has different ways of achieving that curve, and none of it's exactly the same. Since records work with a tiny little needle vibrating very, very quickly, any kind of vibration that makes its way to that needle is actually audible, right? So if I put this record on now, well, actually, that's just a record skipping. You can hear that, right? That's just the vibration, of me tapping on the side. The table is not so bad, but definitely up here it is. And that's working its way into the needle. So to prevent that from being a problem, say when you have speakers very, very near your turntables, different DJs will have different solutions on how to solve that. In the New York disco era, some of the more, hardcore sound quality DJs will carry up cinder blocks to put underneath their turntables, just to be able to increase the amount of mass between the floor and their actual turntable. More commonly, what did discos have a lot in the 1970s? They had a lot of rubber bands and they had a lot of ashtrays. So they would stretch these rubber bands and then they put them underneath each feet. And what you see over here is actually kind of a modern equivalent of that, like those balls over there. Those balls are made of sorbothane, which is a modern polymer that's designed specifically for absorbing vibration. This is a much cheaper version. I can't afford sorbothane balls. So that's kind of the extent that people would actually go to actually make record players work for DJ purposes, because record players were never designed for DJs. They were designed for home use. They were designed for hi-fi use, for private listening. They were never designed for a large audience. Even the ones that finally became standards in clubs were always designed for home use. They were never designed for DJs to begin with. Not until maybe after turntables stopped being a common home appliance did they start focusing specifically on DJs, because DJs were still the only ones buying them at that point.